So, hi everyone. We are here joined by Suchitra, and I'm glad to introduce her. Um, so, at LLS Book Club, we this time read Midnight Borders by Suchitra Vijayan. Suchitra has been, as most of you know who have already read the book, that she's a writer, photographer, and researcher who traversed along the Indian borders over 7 years miles to capture stories of those who were affected by partition, in some sense by borders, in some sense by violence of the nation state. Her book captures several encounters within and outside cities, capturing trauma and violence and the memory as people lived in their everyday. Um, Chitra, thanks a lot for joining us. I mean, it's been really nice and almost tough to read your book, but I think it was one of the best that we have LLS Book Club. So thank you for that. I'll be starting with the questions. Maybe, if you have anything to say, that's fine. That's also.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you for selecting the book, reading it, engaging with it, inviting me. And I'm happy I'm here as long as I can. And I'm happy to answer your questions and questions of others who read the book. So glad to be here. Thank you.
So I'll start with the book itself is loaded with a lot of information, and probably why it was more important to engage with all these questions that you were asking through forms of CA and forms of Kashmir while you were covering the trauma that was happening while the trauma that happened in the past and the trauma that was unfolding while you were covering the book. So it happened over the past 7 years. So I think that it is also the time when India was transforming into a more, to say the least, a Hindu nationalist country, which is less and less inclusive, and it's getting crowded. So how did you, when you started, did you think that the idea of nation state would change for you first? Because maybe you started with another idea of nation state. And how did the covering borders, especially borderlines, which are so precarious, and the people who live there are so precarious, they're so vulnerable to the state, maybe the most exposed to the state. So how did your understanding of the nation state?
It would be, I think your relationship with the nation state is a very precarious one. It starts the moment you're born. And for many of us who are incredibly privileged, those encounters are not as humiliating, as violent, or as traumatic as it is. But nonetheless, it was also the question of, when we talk about the nation state, it's not one large entity, right? Nation state plays itself out in everyday encounters in a very different way. So I think a lot of us have that experience. I think perhaps we don't connect our lived experiences with what one sees on the book. So the nation state always seems grander. There's a gravitas. There's historians of the nation state. Somehow seems to have always had an elevated. It's beginning to change now, but always seems to have had a very elevated pedestal, as against those who think and write about everyday encounters that people have, not only with each other, but the structures that regulate their life every single day. So I think for me, that relationship with nation state, or to kind of the theorizing and understanding part of it, happened over the course of writing this book. But I think those murky existence, that discomfort with how we are characterizing ourselves, started much earlier. It started around 9/11. It started for the first time. I was no longer in the top of the pyramid. I was no longer, in someone like me, born to a Hindu father, English-speaking, middle-class existence, always lived in the urban city of Madras. We take so much for granted. You are, in some ways, the nation state was built for people like me and many others who carry these characteristics. For the first time, when you travel, you realize that you're no longer in the receiving end of that privilege. all of a sudden you're a brown body that is migrating. And I saw what happened to many of my friends who were Muslims, Arabs, Black, in the years after 9/11. And the work I did, whether it was looking at the work in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, later in Cairo, after that in Afghanistan, the question of citizenship and how people encounter the state, all kinds of states, the violent ones, democratic ones, authoritarian ones, have always been there. And that often contradicted my own upbringing, where my grandfather was a freedom fighter, one of independent India's first political prisoners. My father was, on the other hand, a more Nehruvian lawyer who always believed at home that India was secular. That I remember my grandfather once telling me that you have no idea how lucky you are to be born and you're a child of an independent nation. I was a colonial subject, even though he disagreed with how those freedoms later played out. At home, we believed that we were secular because my life was secular. We had people who had married out of family. We had people who came from all different religions. My parents themselves had an intercaste marriage. They came from different caste, class backgrounds. They spoke different languages. We had friends who were Muslims, Christians, Jews. It just felt that that idea of India was so much. But I also understand now that that was an exception. That the privilege of secularism was also something only a small minority of us ever experienced. And writing this book, I think those ideas that we were secular, we were tolerant, somehow we were different, right? Somehow India was different, that we have a constitution that changed because all of these values are not granted. You have to work at being secular. You have to work at being a democracy. You have to work at being just and equal. And I think that while the inclinations that this was not perfect was always there, I think traveling and writing this book kind of solidified those ideas, but also the question is not about saying, oh, something is wrong. I think the book's main question is, yes, we know something is wrong, but what comes next? And I think that was very important as
well. Thank you for that. But also, I wanted to ask, because you spoke of that the ideas of secularism were different and probably not distorted in the very sense of the word, but distorted in the sense that has been taken by the constitution perhaps, or which is projected as ones. I also want to understand, since you were traveling and seeing this, you were also looking at association and membership. And because citizenship is a theme of the entire book, which starts with your sense of citizenship, that you become a paper citizen, perhaps not getting entered into Pakistan, or not being able to enter a nation just for your research, or being subjectified by the white eye for being the brown person that you are, even though you are an upper caste woman of privilege. And in India, that might be different from, and that changes. Your identity also, and your sense of membership with your country, and your sense of membership fails itself when you travel beyond the nation. And now we are talking about people who are much less privileged, have only experienced trauma and are making their life every day based on that trauma and living with it. So how did your idea of association and membership formed during this? Because I'm going to come at the preliminary questions, but this is something that just came to me right now.
Sure. So let's start at the beginning, right? When you're a child of an intercaste marriage, and when you grow up in Madras, again, Madras is a very different city. Urban Madras still tends to be very different. And not being a Brahmin, and that itself puts you the discomfort of not, yes, the privilege of being urban and of being born to an upper caste Hindu father gives you a lot of privileges, but it also takes you out of equations. Because growing up, none of my friends' families had that, right? The sense that you always have a sense of code switching, right? You had to be different things. I could speak like different people in different places because the first thing as a child that you do is to belong. So even within that, even if you're a little different, and I'm trying to say it within the continuum of privilege and how one places it. What protected us was that we were urban, we were upper caste within that urban setting. The same protections would not be available, say, for our Muslim friends or Christian friends. For example, once we were going to my father's friend's daughter's wedding, and this was taking place in a school. This was a Muslim wedding, and I said, "Why is this wedding taking place in school?" And then my father's friend very kindly said, "Oh, that's because they never rent out wedding halls for us, for Muslims." For the first time, even, and these are people, again, these are upper caste Muslims who have access of privilege and wealth. You see very quickly that even though the constitution guarantees all of this, by a way of living, it became very clear that even wedding halls were not rented out to Muslims and Christians. So often they would rent out school buildings and school auditoriums to do it. This was happening in the 90s, and this is not now India. And that recognition that even when we claim a certain sense of secularhood, sense of equality, the everyday existence of it changes in every single way. There are places in which I remember how caste performs. I remember I was 12 and I went to a friend's house, a Brahmin household, and the first question that was asked to me was, "Are you Iyer or Iyengar?" As if, what Brahmin are you? Because we can't identify who you are. When I was told I wasn't, I was very quickly, that was the last time I ever got invited to this person's house. This was, again, 90s, secular, liberalized India. So even for someone like me, caste works in a very specific way. And imagine what happens if I didn't have the privilege of all of this. What happens to someone who doesn't have the privilege, right? So we're talking about belonging in community, but also we have to understand very specifically that we all have to constantly assess our positionalities. The moment I cross the border, the moment I leave, even this modicum of privilege that one has, which is important. And I think one thing that people forget is that accumulation of privilege is important in India or any of societies similar to India, not because of anything else, but because it simply makes living easy. Your encounters with people, with state, something as simple as getting into a school, renting a marriage hall, all of it becomes easy once you accumulate privilege, accumulate all kinds of privilege. And some people, no matter even if they cross the class boundaries, can never accumulate caste privilege. So I think that kind of understanding, that took me a very long time, because it's very difficult to understand how that works. And learning to understand that really helped. And once you cross, then you realize that as a brown body in a predominantly white space, what it means to even not have that modicum of privilege, because even if I acquire those things, I will never be in a position to do the things that I want to. So I think association also changes. My friend Raj Shekhar has another wonderful book called Despite the State. There he documents that post-Gujarat, you see how communities have become more and more insular. It's not that you will not rent your house out to a Muslim anymore. It's not that you'll only rent your house to a Hindu. You'll only rent your house to a person belonging to your same caste, now same subcaste. Everything else will be refused. So in that sense, I think how people were constituting themselves in the aftermath of these things are also very important. And I think it's very important for us to kind of think about associations, citizenships, and belongings in a very positional. What I'm trying to say is that these positionalities are very local. History and memory is local. And that individual location has to be assessed over and over again.
I'll probably come back to the question of citizenship, because when I was reading the book, I was reminded of Nirja Gopal Jayal and Veena Das also in some matters, because you talk of the people. I think it sense of the everyday was coming there, and it was almost apparent. I will come back to that, but since I didn't ask the primary question of how did the idea of this book come about, why did you wanted to write it in the first place?
So I think the idea of the book happened. I had just come back from Afghanistan. I had spent about, I think, 2 years in Afghanistan, a big part of it doing work on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. A lot of my ethnographic work was based on Paktika province. And it was an interesting moment because the questions that I went there with were not the answers that I was getting. And instead, it became important to document what I was seeing. I was seeing a lot, and I wanted to make sense of what all of this is. And a lot of the times, academic research can become frustrating because you go in with a particular question. My question was looking at insurgency practices, but also why has the world's largest territorial army failed in Afghanistan? How do we critique the American empire and what it has done? But of course, it's very difficult to critique an American empire when you are in the belly of the beast. And I felt that my question itself was incorrect and insufficient. So what does one do when one recognizes that one's questions are incorrect and the contexts are insufficient? So I kind of did this thing that I know to do, in which I would just document what I was seeing, and then I would make sense of that. And the sense of the center and the periphery, of course, has been a question of academic research across various disciplines for a very long time. So nothing that I was thinking was new. But I wanted to make sense of what I was seeing and recording it and analyzing what I was doing. And I think when I came back, I think one of the questions, it happened over a phone call with a friend. And I said, what would I find if I did the same thing with India? And by this time, I had been away from India for over 10 years. I left, I was in a South Asianist by training. A lot of the work that I had done was looking at questions of international law, refugee crisis, prosecutions for war crimes. I hadn't done South Asia work. I wasn't a South Asianist by training. And I wanted to also understand what was happening, because this was a time when a lot was happening. You had the Hanazares movement was happening, the anti-corruption things was happening, and yet you could find a certain kind of churning. Even as early as 2012, Narendra Modi was being feted as India's next prime minister. And I really didn't understand how that was possible. How is it that despite overwhelming documentation, state archives, public archives, reporting, that someone who had such a very specific role in creation of violence and had won because of certain things could be feted? And any kind of critique or criticism was very quickly drowned by arguments of development, how the Gujarat model had succeeded. But even in 2012, there were people who were telling you that the Gujarat model had not succeeded. Again, one wonders, why is it that we had lost our capacity to listen? Why we had lost our capacity to see what was in front of us? Third, of course, was this overwhelming attrition in terms of so many who one would think as scholars of liberal leaning, I wouldn't call them left, very quickly went on to justify this. They said that, look, politics and power would moderate Modi. Let's give him a chance. This is the light of Banaras. Like, there's a whole list of people who went on to defend. And so I think I was trying to understand what was it that was happening that was creating all of this, but also what kinds of stories were being weaponized to justify this kind of a rule. And I think I also never quite understood. I think when you grow up in Madras, India looks very different to you than when you grow up in, say, Delhi. I think your view of the world is very different. I mean, we still can't get NDTV folks to pronounce Tamil Nadu properly. They still call it Tamil Nadu. You still can't get them to pronounce Karnataka properly. They call it Karnatak. You still can't get people to pronounce my name properly because, I don't know, it's ridiculous. So in that sense, one also wonders, what does it mean to think about the Indian nation state for someone like me, whose experience of the Indian nation state is very different? Again, I can give you many, many reasons as to why this book started, but in reality, it was simply a whim that said, okay, I want to do this and let's see what I would find. What I thought would take me 6 to 8 weeks or maybe 12 weeks, of course, took 8 years. India is in the subcontinent, or what one calls India today, is very unpredictable. I think that's one of the last good things we have about it, is that it was unpredictable. I didn't think it was going to take me 7 years or 8 years. And that's how long it took me. And I don't even think even after 8 years, I actually understand what's happening. What you see is, again, a fragment of so many experiences. And then hopefully there's one way for us to understand a larger picture through all of this.
Thank you for that. Uh, I wanted to, I mean, another theme apart from citizenship and association and partnership is and membership is what I saw was memory, remembrance, and history. The words and themes of memory, remembrance, history often repeat in the book, not as much as patrons, but in like their forms. And there is an attempt to truth telling and forming a truth which was probably never created, perhaps before, and also erased to a certain sense. However, it also reminded me of Morris Holbach's work, which shows like individual memory, which cannot be separated. So his argument of that how individual memory cannot be separated by the collective. So the individual is forming his memory while he's listening from others, or they are listening from others and making it their own form. So, do you think, but I think that your book sort of reverses that, because the idea of the collective partition is, yes, true, it's trauma, but it's perhaps, and or the idea of the borderland is also true trauma, but perhaps not very similar to what you are projecting when you're talking of the individual. Do you think that in many ways giving significance to the collective led to an erasure of the individual within the larger idea of partition, borderlands, and nationhood, and all the traumas that we've gone? So that, and how do you dissociate memory with history? Because I saw one of your interviews and you spoke about the Holocaust and how there was a museum, and how the Vietnam War and all of that resulted beyond these traumas were just remnants of this trauma of people telling their stories, which is not a thing that happened in India. And even now, we are trying to find people to just say their story who haven't spoken enough. So, do you think that part of nation state that happened after like partition? So, like two questions here is: do you think that we give significance to collective memory and led to an erasure of the individual? And do you think that nation states' work was after partition was also forgetting that there was a violence of the partition?
Um, it's a very, thanks for that. It's an important question, but it's also a very difficult question. Um, I think memory is a very odd thing. Memory is an absolutely odd thing. And this goes back to the fundamental problem with writing a book like this is that history and memory is so local. Yet, there is a need to conflate the global to local, the local to global, always constantly trying to make sense of this experience in relationship to everything else. And I think that, of course, affects how we think about it. With the partition, and I think not just the partition, I think the making of India's borders or borderlands is an ongoing process. It's still happening. It's continuous and ongoing. So it's not that 1947 happened and everything got, I think we are still seeing. One could argue that what happened, the Delhi violence that happened last year in the heart of Delhi in February, is also a way of that partition playing out. So that act of butchering, remaking the borders, the borderlands. Of course, India's borderlands has also changed. So in that sense, the making, and it's ongoing. When something is ongoing, it's kind of hard to really put a pin on it. It's very difficult to put a pin on it. And I'm kind of going to take you back to another instance. It doesn't appear in the book. I couldn't put in the book. It's around 2010. I was just about to start my graduate school, and I wanted to spend the summer in Sri Lanka. I was thinking about, the IDP camps, and the IDP camp are still there. I was writing to the Center for Policy Research there to see if I could do some kind of research work, and someone that I spoke to said something very interesting. So Suchitra, it's a very important moment to kind of think about the present histories of what happened. For all purposes, the de facto Elam state was destroyed, and people are now in IDP camps. And I think it's important for us to speak to them now, because people will now have to, because everything has been taken away from them, people would now have to start rewriting their stories just to survive. what we hear today will not be what we hear tomorrow. Sometimes it's an act of survival. Sometimes it's an act of, it's an existential threat. And I think that kind of stuck with me in many ways. And you see this with Nazi Germany, where people were given the opportunity to rewrite their stories, where when the denazification was happening, people were told to write their versions of the story, where the state went out of the way to give people the leeway and say, oh, we did not think this way, we were forced. So in a sense, kind of rewriting your positionalities to plead for a certain kind of mercy or forgiveness. We saw this happen in Iraq during the de-Baathification, where the entire country that had the Iraqi card, the membership of the Baath Party, were all fired from the job. But at one point in time, in Iraq, Saddam Hussein had made it almost mandatory for anybody who worked with the state to carry a card of the Baath Party. So in that sense, now, what was the de-Baathification process? It was trying to make sure that, of course, how would you relinquish yourself out of the responsibility of being complicit in a great crime? And yet not everybody was complicit in the same way. Maybe some people were not complicit. Maybe some people. So in that sense, this rewriting your memory through erasure, through rewriting, to willful lying, is something that is demanded for the creation of a collective entity. And I think that just happens everywhere. So it's very hard to put it into it. And that's why telling a lot of these stories became about focusing on the individual. It is individual narratives. It is their experience and giving them the time to breathe, going back over years to do the same interviews over and over again, reading things back to them to kind of make sense of it, giving people the agency to contradict themselves, giving them, because contradiction is also a way of life, because I don't think I remember the same. For example, if I went out for a walk tomorrow, today the way I will remember this walk will not be what I would remember tomorrow. So I think that is very inherent in that. And also some people just wanted to forget, as you rightly said. For example, my friend Jitesh Tamchandani's family, both of his parents were Sindhis. He says that as children of partition, they never wanted to speak about it. They just wanted to move on. They never understood why this memorialization was important. Right? We lost our home. We have nothing now. Let's go on. We don't want to talk about it. In other cases, the memorialization is so excessive that every act was, and one cannot hold people accountable for that. Because you're all responding to a moment, right? Even the act of writing is a privilege. I can respond to certain things because I had the privilege of doing this. And I think it's very important to kind of take into account. Maybe 30 years ago, somebody like me would have never been able to do a book like this. If I had lived in India, I would have never been able to do a book like this. So let me also be very clear. There's no way, because this book was turned down by everybody in India. Nobody thought this book would ever get written. So I think that's also important to understand. Because whether we like it or not, only certain kind of people get to tell certain kind of stories. I think that also affects how memory is memorialized. So yeah, I think it's very difficult, and often one has to tread with both caution, but also constantly revisit what that methodology of writing these stories out is.
And I'm glad that you did, because in no matter, you try to occupy their space or try to claim something more than what the book was doing. And I heard in one of your interviews that you said that you know what it means to be a footnote in the history. And I think the book is important in that sense, because it's a telling of something which, even though it's individual, I think the trauma is something which is probably common, and it runs, or the themes of violence is probably common, which will resonate with communities. I also wanted to ask about the structure of the book. So the structure is, so what I saw is that you start like with how you came to write this book, and then you talk about, while you're talking about everything else, about Bangladesh, about Afghanistan, about India, you're talking about what is happening right now, like within. maybe in the past year, the abrogate, which is later than the past year, but the past year was CAA and NRC. And then you're talking about Bangladesh, and you're talking about India-Bangladesh borders. You're talking about illegality, while you're also hopping back and forth into this present. So did that the structure came automatically to you, or did you? I mean, you wanted the reader to be aware of how this book, unfolded while these events were also happening simultaneously. Here you're interacting with someone from Kashmir, and at the same time there's illegality over that person. You are trying to also not put too many names into it, because ambiguity becomes important when you're talking about the state in certain sense for the people. But at the same time, it is also to include. So how is that decision made? How is the structure, come about?
I think I have to thank both my editors for helping me think through the structure. And I'll be the first person to tell you outright that what I envisioned of the book is not what you have in front of you. So the structure was in so many ways, the structure and the form in so many ways was informed by the present. Let me tell you how. The book manuscript was due in November of 2019. And the months leading up, the book just fell apart, because in August you had the CAA NRC, you had abrogation of Article 370, you had the Ayodhya judgment, and then I was in India. I was in India for personal reasons, but I was finishing writing the book, and the protest started, and it felt unfair to sit and write a book when there were protests and I could not be there. So I would turn up in every protest I could in whichever city I was in. And because of so much had happened so quickly, a lot of the people who were part of this book no longer wanted to be a part of this book. That's why there's no Gujarat in it. Not because I didn't go and do the work, it's just that nobody from there wanted to be a part of this book anymore. The NRC CAA chapters were much bigger, and we just had to take names out because nobody wanted to be a part of it. So there were two options. One, I could have gone ahead, because these were interviews that were done. People initially given permission. Nothing would have stopped me from going ahead. But I'd also said that this book was going to be not an exercise in my ego. It was going to not about me telling their voices. I was not giving voice to anyone. All of the people in the book are eloquent, articulate voices of their own predicament, which meant that if I was putting the people in the book as a priority, then it was only right that I respected their wishes, that no longer there, so that the structure fell apart. And we had to rebuild the structure with whatever we had. Another part of the book that you'll never get to see is that for almost everybody that I spoke to, I think in 80% of the cases, people had kept their own people made their own maps. We had maps of Khalistan that people had drawn 30 years ago of what they envisioned their homes would be. There were maps that were drawn in Nagaland, in Manipur, maps in Kashmir that people drew of their societies, their communities, what they thought they belonged. But those maps cannot go into this book, because we have laws in India that very specifically state that there can only be one representation of what this India is. One of the other things that I constantly get asked is, oh, we wish we had more maps in the book. The only maps I could reproduce are maps that the Indian state sanctions as right. But those very maps are the maps that we are saying that don't exist in people's memory landscape, or those maps are violent. So we couldn't reproduce the same violence. So that's why you see you have old maps that say, how India could be divided. How do you reproduce maps that are violent in their very nature, that don't take into account of history, and you're claiming to write the people's history? And most of the people in this book actually don't care about these maps, not in any real meaningful way. So this book the structure is a response to the realities of our time. The structure is a response to the current. There were so many images. There's one moment where in the India book, some images don't appear that appear in the US book, because I actually forgot pay attention, but my editor, Ajita, my India editor, Ajita, very quickly pointed out to Suchitra, in this case, the individual's name appears, their photograph appears, we know which village. Do we want to take this risk and put their photograph? And somebody said, oh, but this is such a stunning image. It shows everything. It shows the community. But then we said, no, we're not doing it. We're not doing it because maybe there's a very small chance that something would happen. But if that happens, then so the structure is the result of where we live, and it's very sad. It's very sad. And also the book is so heavily footnoted because when we did legal edits, and I can't believe that we do legal edits in India now, large sections of the book came back as saying sedition, creating communal disharmony. And for example, there's a sentence in the book that says BSF is an opaque organization. And the lawyers actually thought that somebody would file a case and I had to find resources to say BSF is an opaque organization. I mean, that's why the book already had a lot of citations and notes, but almost every sentence has a citation and note because we are trying to give citations for a lived experience. And that affected the book. The book could have been a very different book, but this is the book that we could produce given where we are. And eventually the question was, how truthful can you write a book and make sure it reaches as many people as possible without putting those people in danger and also not getting the book back? That is exactly where we are. We are worried that we can no longer, anything can get banned today. You could get arrested for a tweet. You could get arrested for traveling to report on a rape murder. Anything could happen. So I think that's the structure is very much a result of the times we're living in. It's not a perfect structure, but it is where the structure, that's how we put it together.
I completely understand, and I think its speech is, the moment it gets out, it is offensive. So we can't really deal with that. I'm going to read out a line from your book, which is where your book ends, where you mention about your daughter and Natasha together, who's like one of the stories that you've recorded. I think about Natasha's little one, Kabir, sleeping across town. If not for us, we owe it to our children to purge this hate that has separated families and histories over 70 years. We owe it to Meera and Kabir. And before that, you write that I get home after 11 p.m. that night. I go over and kiss my 3-year-old daughter, Meera. And why I read this is also because I think that the book is not, while it is not capturing someone's experience and trying to tell it as their own or trying to portray them as savages who cannot speak for themselves, I think that the book is emotive and it is descriptive. It is a collection of narratives, but it has also retained your narrative within that and how you were feeling within that moment. Because in many conversations, you say how the people looked at you. So it was also your first person perspective, which was coming, and your idea of that environment, which you have described very beautifully, without invisibilizing your identity or theirs, which is, I think, a very tough thing to do. So, I also, like, apart from that, I also felt that you were writing this book with a certain draft. Although part of it, you say, has been chopped and like a major part which you wouldn't have wanted to. I think that the wrath and the frustration of violence or maybe not as much helplessness, but as just anger, has translated into the language of the book. Especially when it is mentioning of the present, not as much when it is narrativizing, but when it is sort of concluding and sort of telling you that this is where we are. So that part, I think, was the part that most shook me also in some sense, because it was so true. So were you conscious of it, of like putting yourself there also in the book? Because part of you, we can see there. And do you still, of course you do carry the anchor. There's the Polis Project, we will probably talk about it towards the end. But Just that. Were you conscious of including yourself?
So, two-part answer. First, the first book proposal of this book was so academic. When I go back to it, I want to stab myself. That's how academic it was. And I think there was a deep fear in, I think I was very afraid of actually being a writer and actually writing what I was seeing in front of me. To even be a writer takes a lot of courage because it requires a certain kind of honesty to write a book like this. And I think a friend of mine, and I think along the way, I think a lot of the books, the wisdom in the book also is not mine. It comes from a lot of other people who passed it on to me, who said that, look, eventually people have to see the world in your eyes without it becoming one of those Indiana Jones type where you don't want to be the one who parachutes in and claims to tell a story that hasn't been told before. And I think a lot of writing, a lot of nonfiction long form writing from the subcontinent. I mean, this is true of elite Indians, Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, Bangladeshis. It's the same kind of people who've always held intellectual, political capital, telling the same kind of stories over and over again, as if we've Columbused this entire universe for the first time. While in reality, people have been doing this for a really long time. So I really had to learn to be a good writer, to write and think and analyze the present I was experiencing. And also not put myself, because a lot of long fiction, long form travel writing is, I went there, I saw this. And that implicates you with a certain kind of anthropological colonial writing in which even when the white sahibs stopped writing about it, the brown sahibs took over. We became the eloquent voice of the empire. The colors of the skin changed, but in reality, we were still doing the same violence to it. I didn't want to do it. I really didn't. And that's why I did something in which I put a lot of the entire conversations are in quotes because I just wanted their voice to come through. At the same time, my editors and everybody said, we need to put a lot of you in. And I think it's a very even well-meaning people who said, put yourself in it, didn't realize the violence of putting myself in it when it was somebody else's story. So the way I thought about it, and I think the one in which I am the most angry about is, I think I'm angry across, but I'll talk about anger as politics and anger as theory in a bit, is that in Natasha's chapter, I could, because it was personal. It was personal in a way in which it was a conversation between two friends, right? I see Kabir at least once a month. I see Natasha more. Our children grew up, and the only way for Natasha and Kabir to have a relationship is in New York. I don't know if Natasha and Kabir can have a relationship if Natasha and Kabir were in India. Right? Gone are the days when figures like Natasha and Kabir or versions of them could have actually, had friendships, could have been. So I think, why is it that friendship is only possible here and not elsewhere? And that is anger. I mean, it's a deep anger for what it means. And also a sense of anger that comes from your home being destroyed. And I think it feels stronger when you're so far away. I've been away from my home since I was 17. So when you see your home being destroyed from far, it hurts more. It really does. It really gives you a sense that you can never go back to a place. Not that much the place of my childhood was Shangri-La. It wasn't. It was just as horrible. It was just maybe perhaps better for me, maybe my own nostalgia. But there are things Suchitra could do as a child of the 90s that Suchitra, the adult, cannot do in the present. That is indeed true. My parents had friends who were interfaith couples. I don't think that is possible in today's India, sadly so. Given that there was a Facebook hit list that was circulated of interfaith couples, especially public-facing couples, professors, writers, actors, And there is an anger, and I think that did come through. So I tried to put my anger in places where I was talking about my experience of this country, not their experience of the country. Second, anger is a powerful tool. Anger clarifies things. Anger is political. Anger is radical. Anger is the only thing that's actually saved this country and its people. Every time someone has gone over, whether it was the reign of Indira Gandhi, whether it was the anger of the people, is what has kept this country alive. It won us the freedom. It also, in some ways, tried to protect. The anger on the streets and the hope that comes with anger, because anger is not just anger. I'm not talking about anger, the violence that created Delhi. I'm talking the anger that created Shaheen Bagh, which also birthed a new kind of hope. And there's a reason why they pushed back. The anger of the farmers' protest is literally what is stalling things. And that anger is political. It is uncomfortable, but it is not trivial. It's powerful. It's perhaps the last thing that can challenge people. Because the moment we refuse to, the anger also means you refuse to accept the present. Anger is just as radical as hope. And I think that's another thing that was very important. That I was anger. You could call me an angry woman. And I also understand that when you're an angry woman, you are seen as crazy and not a scholar. Because an angry man is seen as an angry young man. An angry woman is just mad. She's just chaotic. So it's fine. It's if Audre Lorde and everybody else have to deal with the predicament. An angry woman writing in India today is a threat. She's also seen as crazy, right? I think there was one review in which somebody actually called me a silly girl, which was very funny because I haven't been a girl for over 10 years. But yes, I think anger was very much a political choice, but also choice in terms of form and narrative.
I don't think it's a bad thing to be a mad person and to be crazy, because Shakespeare has told us that Othello was mad mood. And when he was mad, it was the only time when he had attained his senses back. So I think it's absolutely fine to be mad and to be crazy and to be angry at certain things.
But look the ending that Othello ends up with, right? It's great we have Othello, but look what ending Othello ends up with, right?
Yeah, that's the sad part of Shakespeare, how he contradicted himself. But the part is that, I mean, the important thing for me is also that, what I also noticed that I read Precarious Lives by Judith Butler in my master's, and I was reading about mourning in that particular book. And I think the similar thing this book has, although it is not academic in nature like the Butler book, but this has done that for me in terms of understanding anger. And in terms of, in many ways, understanding Kashmir also. And understanding why people are angry and why people are quote unquote insurgent, and why people are protesting against the army, against the state, and are battling because they have their own versions of the nation, and which they have created. So perhaps there is where, when the nation tries to impose its association and its membership, and at the same time tries to, disbalance them off it is where the violence happens, which is the problem, I think, of nation, that belongingness is. And I think we are talking at a very fitting time, because tomorrow is 1st November, which is 1984's, it's marked by the biggest violence there could be in terms of, Delhi, before, of course, there's Delhi riots, and the usual, not the normal violence, but the spectacular violence. So, I just have a little question. If you have time, it's fine if you don't have it, we can also try to submit.
I think I can. I think I have another 10 minutes. Okay. And then let me just check. I just need to check. Yeah, I think I have about 10 minutes. So, yeah.
So, because you're talking about state and you're talking about anger also, you have mentioned about BSF, you have mentioned about bureaucracy also, and the executive. Through the book, you've expressed incidents where the state, in the form of executive and the bureaucratic agency, inflicts violence, and does go scot-free because of inconclusive evidence or whatsoever, in terms of, let's say, the army, it's different, tribunals, etc. Could you explain, because Lawctopus is largely about law and dealing with lawyers and legal professionals, Do you explain how do you see the law, like, or you saw the law while you were researching? Because you have already also been a barrister, if I'm not wrong. So that and law as being performative, law in the paper and the people's law, which how did you see that while you were researching?
I think law. I think law is also something that we use very similar to the way we use a very large concept of a state, because there is no one law. I think law works in many ways. I think one of the first things you see is a very inherent contradiction on the ground. You will see two things. All of these communities have been disproportionately affected by the violence legitimated by law, whether it is ASFA, PSA, across the board. For instance, right to life was suspended in Punjab, I think till about, I might have the dates wrong, but I think about early 90s. Right? So I think all of these places, so much of the violence, the physical violence that we can see, record, have been recorded, come from a certain kind of legal validation. It comes from imposition of illegal extrajudicial laws, but laws that exist as what they are. And that is true of the OPA as well. And despite these overwhelming architecture of the law that legitimates violence, you constantly see people trying to negotiate with the same law. It's quite interesting how this everyday interaction shapes laws in those very specific way. You understand ASFA, PSA, but then you will see, for example, the work of JKCCS consistently, Pervez Imroz Saab going and doing the work that they do in the lower courts, challenging the Kunan Pashpura, consistently laying claims of the very institutions that are arbitrary, illegal, and violent, and deeply so. Second thing that you realize about the law is that it's incomplete, it is insufficient, and definitely not something that responds to the present. Law as a living or organization or organism is deeply problematic. And I think one of the reasons I no longer practice is because of the frustration of not being able to reconcile the both. For example, a lot of the work in the tribunal saw the inefficiencies of law. We know that a genocide was conducted, but the legal threshold of proof of genocide was so high that the convictions were almost impossible to get. With the refugee crisis, so when I was running the legal aid clinic out of Cairo, it became very clear that people were fleeing for many different reasons. But the whole process of laws that dictate what asylum is, what refugee status is, was again a question of not so much about question of citizenship or how the law works, because a lot of the laws that we have around refugee crisis was created in the years following the Holocaust, right, which was really looking at a very European predicament. I don't think we have taken into account the lived realities of the aftermath of colonization and recolonization, neocolonization. Climate change, for example, is going to create climate change refugees, and we don't have laws even come close to what it means. So the insufficiency of law is the second aspect of it. The first one is the immense illegality and violence that law carried as justifying. The second is in the absolute way in which it hasn't caught up to it. So that's the second thing. Third was a way in which, despite all of this in India, there is a certain belief of or respect for the revolutionary constitution that Ambedkar gives us. Right? It is revolutionary in every way possible. Imagine a few, millions of colonial subjects automatically granted a certain sense of equality before law. And as Ambedkar rightly says, it's a contradiction. Political equality does not translate to social equality, and I think we are still that way. We are ambushed halfway to freedom. And the same revolutionary constitution that Baba Sahib gives us is also the constitution that has not only committed immense violence in Kashmir, in Punjab, in Nagaland, in Manipur, even in the heartlands of India in 1984. There is no justice for 1994. There is no justice for Nelly. There is no justice for Pilvan Meni. So Another question which was not completely addressed in this book is also the question of, if we are called a republic, and the republic is one that is run by codes of law, rules of law, but those sentiments of law don't actually play out. As you travel through the judicial system, for example, we were trying to do this thing where we were mapping every act of lynching and how it travels through the judicial system. And you realize that the distance between the powerful and those farthest away from power is just going farther and farther away. And that's another aspect of it, I think, was there. So law does, and I think the most legal of the chapters is the Kashmir chapter, because it literally looks at the documents produced by the state. It's like it's Kurosawa. It's literally like Kurosawa's story. Every person has a different story, and every person produces a legal document produced by the state to stake claim to their story. For example, the claim that the Kashmiri police talk is very different from the army's version of the story, right? Even the version of those who were called as collaborators is very different, and you have legal documents produced to justify each version of the story. And what that really shows you is how deeply fragmented the systems are, but also how deeply violent. I think Rohit Day's, one of the books that I really appreciated a lot is Rohit Day's book. And he talks about the ways in which the country's citizens, despite the colossal imbalance of power, try to claim the constitution, the everyday life of the constitution. I also very sadly fear that the reclamation of that everyday constitution is also gone. I think it's sad, but I think it's important for us to recognize that even that reclamation is now gone.
I really hope that it is not. I genuinely hope that it is not, because if that is the case, because Rohit Day's book gave us really some hope, because he was dealing with a lot of state paper, but it was also about the people again and how the people navigated it. Because it was the first book, actually, the one that we read, People's Constitution, at the book.
Oh, okay.
And he was here and we spoke to him about hopelessness, and he was so hopeful that it just startled us. So I guess you are just being a realist right now, not being probably hopeless, but I think we should.
Look, I think the thing is that I haven't lost hope. I think hope is radical. Just as anger, hope is the other side. I'm not hopeful for the people of the country. I believe, as I said, I think they are the last bastion.
Yeah.
But I just don't believe that the existing systems, there's another very interesting argument that Professor Gyan Prakash makes in his emergency book, which I'm very surprised hasn't been banned in India, because it makes a very interesting, and I believe I agree with him now, is that he says that the origins of the Indian constitution itself had the poisonous fruit. Fascism was already in the heart of the Indian constitution. That is why emergency is not an aberration. That is why we could do everything that we are doing without changing a single thing in the constitution. That the beginnings of the constitution in it had immense power, possible in few people, in which the systems could function as long as the people running it the mean was decent, right? The median was decent. The good were very good, the bad were very bad, and the median was not bad. That the constitution could be in some ways reclaimed because people could give judgments. From there, we have a position in which the Ayodhya judgment didn't have names on it. The judges didn't have names on it. Imagine the travesty. I mean, it's the envelope issue that happened. Some of the issues that have affected people, the demonetization is still not being heard. The Kashmir issue is not being heard. But if Arnab Goswami gets picked up, overnight So what I'm trying to say is that the system looked like it worked for certain sections of the population as long as the median was not rotten. The median was never great. Let's also be very clear about it. As long as the median wasn't rotten, we could survive. And there's another interesting analogy that a friend of mine said is that, it's like a pressure cooker. The pressure keeps building, and every few years you have one decent line and one horrible judgment. The gasket goes off, and he says, "Oh my God, India's constitution has been reclaimed. Great Supreme Court, great High Court." Now the difference is that the pressure cooker, the pressure letting mechanism is also gone. The median is not only now completely rotten, the entire system is rotten for various reasons. So the median is rotten. Now the pressure cooker, which once let out the pressure every few years with one decent line in a very flawed judgment, still gave people the belief that the system worked. But vast majority of people in this country who are farthest away from power always knew the truth that the system will not work for them. That is why Rohit's book is so phenomenal, because it says how they reclaimed it. They did all kinds of gymnastics to reclaim it. Now the problem is the core is rotten, the system is flawed, the foundations are flawed, and we no longer have the space for vast majority of people to do the various gymnastics that they could do to reclaim what was their constitution, not for anything, not to make billions of dollars, to simply lead a reasonably dignified outcome is gone. I think this does not mean that I don't have hope. I think it simply means that we have to be very crystal clear in terms of analysis so we can fix it. Right? So when you know the system is rotten and is going to crumble, then hope is not going to fix it. I think naming the beast is very essential to fix it. One has to have immense hope to believe that it can be fixed. So I don't think my hope is depleted. It's very difficult to be hopeful these days. But I also don't think that the space for navigation is there anymore.
I mean, I agree with you that it was a violent law in the moment it was born out, because it was just carrying forward a colonial understanding of it. It was just reinterpreted in a manner that, you have spoken somewhere that your grandfather was imposed with sedition. Although he said that you are lucky to be living in a free country, but maybe because he was running a communist Tamil paper, he was accused of sedition. Of a law
No. He was accused of the sedition case is because they tried to organize workers in the Neyveli corporation. So the Janasakti never had sedition charges against it when he was there.
Okay.
So he and a lot of those workers, they were charged for organizing the workers against. So this was basically organizing a labor union. So that's why they were picked up as, not because they were running. Not because it was a printer publisher of Janashakti. The sedition charges happened because of the Neyveli Labor Workers Union. So again, it's very interesting to see that this crime of sedition was because you were trying to organize workers for better pay, better work. And then they were charged saying that they had caused violence in the process of organizing. So it's yeah.
It's almost Nadeep Kaur, but like with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted to just end this with you're working on the Polis Project, and you've also, I think, co-founded it, if I'm not wrong. Could you just speak about that? Because you have this book, you are also a researcher, you are a writer also, and a very really amazing writer, and also a photographer, because you have not only recorded words and all of that, but you have recorded like photographs. And I say that here Benjamin goes wrong because the aura is not lost. They look as grim as they should be, as real as they do, even with the copies being produced. But I really would want to know about the Polis Project, how you're taking forward, and will you ever publish those the ambiguity which is left, like things that did not make to the book? Will we have a Suchitra diary like Kafka's? I mean, are we going to not that in a depressive way, but just as a record?
I'll take the last question first. I think this book is done. I don't know, maybe if I'm older, I'll just donate all of that to an archive for people to do with it what it is. But I think this book is done. This book is a result of Yeah, I think this book is a result of a very specific time. I can't even go back and replicate the same journey now. I don't even think I can go to these same places now, how things are. So no, I don't know. I think it's, I don't know. I don't know. Again, the question is when people don't want certain things, then I do not know if it makes sense to memorialize it. But maybe there's one way to save them would be to just, if at any point in time, maybe a few years down the lane, I don't have the resources for it. If at all there's an archive, or if there's an archive it can be donated to, I would love to maybe do that as a way. But also, again, the question is of ethics. If people don't want their stories to be told, who am I to put it out? I think that is always going to be the question. So I don't know. I don't know if I would even ever get to write another book on India. I don't know. I don't know if anybody would get to write a book on India anymore. We don't. I don't know. I really don't know. So I'm going to be very honest about it. Polis Project started. The early ideas of Polis Project has been around for quite some time. I think I've been talking about this to people since 2015-16, and it started because it became clear that research had become so ossified. We were all writing papers for 4 people to read, and journalism was almost gutted. I'm not a journalist. I would never call myself one, but and it became clear that we just knew far too many people doing different things. There were many things. And another thing that happened was that Erdogan had, of course, Modi was already in power. Erdogan had come back to power again, and then 2016 Trump came to power as well. And I realized that there was no place, there was no intellectual home for people, many of us like us, who did different things, but who really wanted to bridge research and reportage, but wanted to focus on communities and resistance. And I think it is very important for us that to understand the relationship between that Kashmir and Palestine were connected, that Thoothukudi and Ferguson were connected, because the oppressions that people live through are a result of very specific ways in which they want to extract labor from us. Erosion of citizenship. So in 2017, I reached out to Francesca Recchia and Asim Rafiki, and I said, we should build this out as a collective and see what happens. And that's how Polis was born. It was born because, and everybody said it won't work. They said, and I did like a pitch, somebody said do a pitch deck, and I didn't know what the hell pitch deck was. And we had research, reportage, and resistance, and somebody said, you can't have resistance, nobody will fund you. And nobody funded us, it's fine. We bootstrapped everything with my money, and then we had an idea of what we wanted to do, which was we wanted to produce work that was the hybrid in the intersection of research and reportage, but taking all of this important critical knowledge to a larger, wider audience. So we don't do news, we don't do op-eds, but what we do is in-depth long-form analysis as podcasts, as videos, as long-form, and build a robust platform that was both in the virtual world and in real. In New York, we did public programming, which was shut down after pandemic, but mostly trying to figure that out and do it in a way that was meaningful. People think we're pretty large. We're not, but we are an incredibly small group of people who do this. For the first time in many years, we actually have full-time staff that we've hired. And a lot of the work we do is to continue doing that. While our predominant focus happens to be South Asia, it's very important for us to understand how oppression works. So that's why we work with KGOK to talk about war on terror and how war on terror disproportionately affects Muslim communities in UK and in the US, but also what happens to how law got weaponized the years after 9/11 in India. So there are connections in all of that. And that hopefully that's what we've done. I think we turn 5 early next year. So Polis started as a WordPress blog that I coded, and lawyers should not code. Then finally, after 4 years, we now have a new website. And I'm just absolutely stunned at the amount of work that we've done. We have Watch the State, which does research on state violence, which is literally watching the state and thinking through it. So that's what Polis does. It's been 5 years. I don't know how much longer we will get to do it, given how bad things are. But the idea is to keep doing this as long as we can, and hopefully be useful and helpful.
I've put up the website link for anyone who wants to check it. I mean, the website is amazing. The place is really nice. And everything that you have there, the content, I think it aligns with whatever there is in terms of Suchitra has just spoken. Thanks a lot. I mean, I think this was one of the best conversations I've had. Also because I think you bring more than just information. I think you bring certain sense of energy and sense, I don't know, warmth, and also like I can't really define what it is, but it's really great. I mean, all your talks were very intense, and it just felt like I could like talk to you more than for a 2 hour session.
It's also because I have 5 years. We only, for some reason, Polis is only, we had one male employee. We only hired women. We only had women researchers, women interns. I think I'm now good with, I have like 5 years of doing therapy session with everyone. So it's good now. I'm being facetious. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks for doing this. And thanks for creating the space for conversations. I always say this, I think these conversations are important. And that's another reason why I always try and say yes when I can, because these are the million mutinies we have. These are literally the million mutinies we have. If people stop having conversations, I think that's when things get even more. And I also understand how it has become more difficult for you to do this. So thank you. And thanks for the great questions. And I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for joining us. And please do keep writing. Maybe write about India a little more when you're sort of feeling in a better space, and because it's too much to, I think, unwrap and also research. Thanks a lot, and all the best.
You.
And happy Halloween. I think it's Halloween.
Yes, I have to do that. So I have to cook for 8 people, and I also have to get my 5-year-old dressed for Halloween. So it's like I have a long Sunday ahead. Thank you so much. I really
please enjoy. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. We'll be having other sessions soon, and thanks. Bye-bye.